They called her a murderer in front of 400 wolves and sent her into the eastern waste with nothing but the clothes on her back and a mark burned into her left wrist that any pack in the three kingdoms could read at a glance. They called it justice. They called it necessary. They did not look at her when they said it. What they could not know, and what she could not yet prove, was that the night of ashen frost in the year 847 would be remembered not as the night the Omega Killer was expelled from Thornwood, but as the night the Lycan King set out on a three-kingdom ride to drag a single truth into a room that had spent 2 months burying it. He would kneel before her, on those same stones. The assembly had not yet learned to imagine such a thing. The tribunal hall of Thornwood Keep had been built to make the accused feel small. Senna Ashvale had understood this in an abstract way before the morning of her sentencing, when she had still been permitted to sleep in the servants' dormitory with a blanket and a candle, and Bramble's warm weight pressing against her shins. She had not understood it the way she understood it now, standing at the center of the floor while tiers of carved stone seating rose around her in a narrowing horseshoe, every bench packed with ranked wolves in their winter mantles, breath fogging the cold air in pale, rhythmic plumes. The rafters were lost in shadow. The floor was flagstone, each slab precisely fitted, cold enough to leach through the thin soles of her boots. She stood on it the way a moth stands inside a jar. Lord Cadron Voss read the charge in a voice built for exactly this kind of room. The murder of emissary Dane Fallow, found stabbed 3 weeks past in the eastern corridor of Thornwood Keep's south wing, a silver-handled trade seal pressed into the wound as a signature. The silver-handled seal, as every wolf in the room knew, had been given to Senna Ashvale by the late trademaster of Thornwood as payment for a winter's work of healer service. No other wolf in the keep had held it. No other wolf in the keep had been alone in that corridor on the night in question. The emissary had been carrying treaty papers that would have redirected the pack's eastern tribute routes, cutting Lord Voss's personal levy interest by 1/3. Senna knew about the tribute routes. She had not known about Lord Voss's levy interest until much later. She scanned the tiers once, not searching for support she had no reason to expect, but looking for her sister. Mira was seated in the lower bench of the witness gallery, her dark hair pinned under a pearl-tipped clasp that Senna had never seen before. She was wearing new clothes. She did not meet Senna's eyes. At the foot of the tiers, pressed between 2 columns near the hall's side door, Bramble lay with his gray muzzle on his forepaws, his single remaining eye fixed on her with an attention no wolf in the room was willing to offer. The verdict was pronounced before Senna was permitted to speak more than 3 sentences in her own defense. The banishment mark was applied to her left wrist by a pack elder with cold hands and a practiced grip. The hot iron burning through skin in a precise oval that smelled like scorched leather, then like something worse. She did not cry out. The winter cloak she wore was confiscated at the hall's outer door. She was escorted to the eastern gate as the sun was going down. The gate closed behind her with a sound like a struck bell. Bramble was on the other side of it. She did not know how he had gotten through. She knelt in the frost-hardened mud and pressed her forehead against his, and held him for a count of 20 breaths while the cold bit at her neck and shoulders. Then she stood, and she walked east into the waste, and he walked beside her. The eastern waste in the late days of the year 847 was not impassable, but it was not friendly. The ground was frozen to a depth that turned her ankle twice in the first hour, the black pine forest closing around the road within a 1/4 mile of the gate. She had her healer's satchel, which she had kept strapped beneath her outer garments during the tribunal, a calculated decision that no one had thought to question, because no one at the tribunal had been thinking about her practicality. Inside the satchel were 3 pouches of dried herbs, a folded square of waxed cloth, a tin of rendered fat, a bone needle and thread, and the ash salt compound her mother had taught her to prepare from the first winter she could hold a mortar. 2 small clay jars of it, sealed with wax stoppers, pressed against the satchel's inner lining. Her mother had called it the last kindness for a silver-burned body. Senna had kept it current out of habit, the way she kept every preparation current, because her mother had told her that a healer who lets her supplies lapse has already decided on some quiet level that the people she might need to help do not quite deserve the effort. She thought about her mother a great deal in the first 3 days in the waste. On the fourth day, she found a hollow in a fallen spruce's root mass large enough to sleep in with bramble, and she had something close to shelter. On the seventh day, she found a frozen stream she could chip water from. On the ninth day, she heard the sound of an army moving. If you've read any story like this one and found yourself wanting someone to finally be believed, to share this one with someone who needs it, drop a name in the comments. This story is just beginning. It was Alistair Thornwood's border campaign returning south. 1,200 wolves in disciplined column with pack banners snapping in the gray wind, and supply wagons leaving ruts in the frozen road that would not thaw until spring. She heard them before she saw them, the low rhythmic crunch of massed feet and the occasional bark of an order carrying through the still air. She moved off the road with the automatic instinct of someone who had learned in the past 9 days that she held no standing in any space another wolf might want to occupy. She would have stayed in the tree shadow and let them pass. She did not, because 40 paces down the road, there was a man lying in the frozen ditch at the army's edge with no one attending him. He was in army gear, a junior supply handler by the cut of it, and he had been left there. Even at 20 paces, she could see the blackish discoloration crawling up his forearm from a wound wrapped in inadequate cloth, and she could smell the wolfsbane corruption, that particular acrid sweetness like burning pine mixed with copper. That meant he had between 6 and 12 hours before the toxin reached his chest. The army was walking past him. Senna crossed the road. She knelt beside him in the ditch and opened her satchel. He was conscious, barely, and his eyes found her with the unfocused intensity of a man in significant pain who cannot quite confirm whether he is imagining things. She unwrapped the wound, a deep puncture from a sharpened iron stake, wolfsbane coated, the kind of thing a border settlement might set in the ground as a deterrent. She cleaned the wound twice with the rendered fat, and then broke the wax seal on the first clay jar of ash salt compound, working it into the puncture in measured pressure with 2 fingers, while she held the soldier's arm steady with her other hand. He made a sound against his teeth. The compound drew the wolfsbane corruption out of a wound by binding to the alkaline compounds in the toxin and pulling them toward the surface, her mother had explained, though her mother had explained it in more poetic terms involving the old ash tree as a hungry listener for poison. The practical result was a discoloration that spread visibly through the skin above the wound for 3 minutes, and then ebbed, the blackish tint draining back toward the puncture site and out, and the soldier's breathing steadied in the way that a fire steadies when it is finally given the right kind of wood. She was wrapping the wound in clean waxed cloth when the shadow fell across her. She did not look up immediately because she had learned in the tribunal hall that looking up when a shadow fell across you was frequently the first step toward something that could not be undone. "Who are you?" It was not a question in the ordinary sense. It was a measurement stated aloud. She looked up then. Alistair Thornwood was exactly as the pack history said he was, which was to say that no physical description of the man had ever adequately prepared any person for the fact of him standing still in a space. He was tall without being architecturally improbable about it, dark-haired, dressed for a border campaign in heavy leather and muted iron, his war cloak pushed back from his shoulders by the cold wind. His face was the kind that had been cut rather than modeled, all clean angles and a jaw set with the particular tension of someone who had learned to hold very still when they wished to see what a situation would reveal about itself. His eyes were a gray so pale they were nearly colorless in the winter light, and they were fixed on her with an attention that felt nothing like the attention of the tribunal hall, and everything like it at the same time. His inner wolf, the history would later record, felt the world tilt sideways in that ditch. He did not show it. Senna told him her name. She said it the way she had learned to say things in the past 9 days, plainly and without ornamentation, because ornamentation cost energy she needed for other things. He looked at her wrist. He looked at the soldier whose breathing had, in the past 4 minutes, become something approaching normal. He said, "Ride with the column," and turned back to his horse. And that was that, except that it was not, because 2 of his guard had stepped forward to ensure that she understood the riding. With the column invitation was not one she could decline. Bramble was acquired into the column's custody by way of sitting down in the road directly in front of the lead guard's horse and staring at it until the horse refused to advance. Alistair, she would learn, found this funnier than he permitted himself to show. She spent the first week in a guarded wagon near the column's center with the supply handlers and the recovered wounded. She was not mistreated. She was not free. The distinction felt academic at 4 in the morning when the column made camp, and she could hear the pine forest pressing against the perimeter and feel the banishment mark on her wrist under her sleeve, like an accusation written in scar tissue. He came to the wagon on the 3rd evening. He stood at its open end with a bowl of campaign broth and set it on the wagon's planking without offering it, the way one sets food near a creature that has reason to be wary of hands. Then he asked her where she had learned the ash salt compound. She told him. Her mother, a healer of the Ashvale line, trained under the Eastern practice traditions before the Western packs, had decided the Eastern practice traditions were worth codifying into official pack medicine. He said nothing for a moment. She could feel the quality of his silence, which was the silence of a man who was thinking rather than waiting. "You're accused of the Fallow murder," he said. "I'm convicted of it," she said, which is not the same thing. The distinction interested him, she could tell, in the way a precisely turned statement interests a person who traffics in precisely turned statements and has rarely heard one from an unexpected direction. He did not push further that evening. He picked up the bowl and handed it to her, properly this time, and left. The deniable cracks were small at first, the way cracks always are before you understand what they are cracking. He sent a heavier blanket to the wagon on the 4th day, not through a guard, but through the army's own healer, a woman named Petra, who was forthright about the fact that the order had come from the king himself, and who looked at Senna's wrist mark with an expression that held no contempt. On the 6th day, when one of the supply handlers in the wagon made a pointed comment about the company of criminals in a tone designed to carry, Alistair happened to be within range, and the supply handler was reassigned to perimeter latrine work without ceremony. On the 9th day, when the column passed through a trading settlement and Senna mentioned offhandedly that she had identified a rotting support beam in the settlement's main storage hall when they had been watering the horses, he sent 2 carpenters back to address it before the column moved on. None of it was for her, she told herself. None of it was personal. He was a king who kept his column functioning and his territories standing, and she had happened to cross the radius of his operational care. She told herself this with great conviction. On the 12th evening, he sat across the fire from her, rather than at it, in the arrangement that made him approachable to officers, and she caught the scent of him fully for the first time in 12 days of proximity and careful management on her part. It was pine resin and cold iron, and something underneath that had no useful name, something that hit the back of her throat like the first breath of the year's first thaw, a sensation that spread from her sternum outward in a warmth entirely disproportionate to the fire's heat, and she set her cup down with great care and looked at the ground until the warmth did what she told it to and went away. It did not entirely go away. He was looking at the fire. If the same recognition had moved through him, he had swallowed it down into the same place he kept everything else he had decided, for the time being, not to act on. They traveled 19 more days after that. The column approached the outer settlements of Thornwood's capital territory on a gray morning in the year's 53rd day, the frost on the wagon's canvas so thick it crackled when the wind moved it, and Senna understood that whatever the next stage of her detainment would be, it would involve walls and a fixed cell and a trial. She had even less chance of surviving than the first one. It was on that 53rd day, when the lead supply wagon took a rut wrong and split a wheel spoke, that she was assigned to help inventory the transferred supplies while the wheel was repaired. The column's dispatch pouch, separated from its courier by the wheel incident and, sitting temporarily in the wrong wagon, was not her concern. She would not have touched it except that it slid from the bench when the wagon jolted, and she caught it, and the outer seal had cracked in the fall, and the letter that slid halfway free had a secondary seal on its interior fold that she recognized before she could stop herself from recognizing it. A five-pointed knot with the innermost loop crossed left rather than right. A cipher she had made up when she was 9 years old, sitting on a stone floor in the Ashvale house, teaching her younger sister how letters could carry messages inside messages. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She thought about the eastern waste. She thought about Bramble sitting in the road in front of a warhorse. She thought about her mother's hands in the mortar, patient and efficient, going on after the third failure because the fourth attempt might be the one that found the correct proportion. She thought about what happened to people who did nothing with evidence of their own condemnation. She sealed the dispatch pouch, walked to the front of the column, and placed it in Alistair's hands herself. She told him the cracked seal was an accident. She told him which letter to open, and why she knew what the cipher meant, and who had taught it to her. He read it standing on the road with his war cloak lifted by the wind. The letter was from Lord Voss to a man Senna did not know, a man in the capital's eastern ward, and it concerned the delivery of a message to a specific cell location at a specific hour. The message was to be wordless. The letter was precise in its instruction about the wordless message resulting in no one asking further questions about the fallow trial. She watched Alistair's face while he read it. It changed in a way so small that she could only call it a change because she had spent 53 days learning the architecture of his composure and could identify the single degree of shift around his eyes and jaw that meant something had restructured inside him. His inner wolf, somewhere far beneath the surface, had arrived at a word it would not say for several more weeks. He looked at her. He said, "Which cell?" She said, "I assume the one they intend to put me in." He said nothing further. He rode to the front of the column and issued a series of orders to his second that she was not within hearing range to interpret, and the column's pace changed. If you've stayed this far, tell me in the comments what you think Mira knew and when. This story earns everything it's about to spend. 2 days later, Senna was housed not in a cell, but in a guarded chamber in the outer keep. A room with a hearth and a window that faced the courtyard, with Bramble permitted inside, and Petra assigned as her attending healer in a formal capacity that gave her a legal status the empty eastern cell could not quite reach. Alistair had left the capital before she woke on the day he departed. The guards at her door changed twice a day and were polite, in the way that guards are polite when they have been given specific instructions about the consequence of being otherwise. She heard nothing from Mira. She heard nothing from Voss. The silence had a weight to it, the particular weight of people who are waiting for news and have decided their waiting looks better if it wears the face of calm. She did not sleep cleanly for 6 of the 7 days Alistair was gone. On the 4th day, a raven arrived with a dispatch mark she did not know, and Petra told her only that the king had reached the first allied kingdom. On the 6th day, another raven. Second kingdom reached. On the 7th day, no raven came. On the 8th day, she heard hooves in the courtyard. Not the sound of a returning patrol, not the measured canter of a messenger, but the sound of a full cavalry company riding through the outer gate with the controlled velocity of horses who have been pushed hard and have not been asked to slow yet, because the thing they are riding toward has not yet been reached. She was at the window before the first rider had fully cleared the gate. Alistair rode at the center of the company, which was already arresting, because kings do not ride at the center. He rode at the center because behind him, in a closed traveling litter flanked by 4 riders in foreign pack colors, was a cargo that needed guarding. And behind the litter, in restraints that Senna could see even at this distance because they caught the pale winter light, was her sister. Mira's face was turned away. Bramble was off the hearthrug and at the door, pressing his gray muzzle against the gap at the door's base, his single eye bright and his stubtail moving in short, hard arcs. Within 2 hours, the word had gone through the Capitol Keep like water through a fractured pipe, and by the time the evening torches were lit in the tribunal hall's brackets, every council member who held a named seat had been summoned. Not invited. Summoned, under the king's seal, with the specific language that the summons carried when refusal was not a category of response. Senna was brought to the hall's side entrance by Petra, who had collected a winter cloak from somewhere in the keep that was a good deal finer than anything Senna had owned prior to her banishment, and who helped her fasten it with the practical kindness of someone who understood that the way a person entered a room could sometimes determine what the room was capable of feeling about them. The hall was fuller than it had been on the night of ashen frost. The tiers were packed in the same horseshoe arrangement, the carved stone benches holding the full winter council and the foreign delegations, and a number of ranked wolves who had no formal seat but had pressed into standing positions along the walls because they had heard something in the summons that told them this was not a procedural meeting. Braziers had been lit at intervals around the floor, the warm orange light breaking the room's habitual winter gray. 2 delegations in foreign pack colors stood in the lower tiers, their travel wear still on them, the mud of 3 kingdoms on their boots, their presence itself a statement about the distance the truth had been required to travel. Voss stood at his council seat with his chin raised in the posture of a man who has decided that the best strategy is to preemptively occupy the space where guilt would stand. Mira was on the floor in restraints with her wrists bound in front of her, her fine hair loosened from the pearl clasp, wearing the expression of a person whose narrative has not yet caught up with their circumstances. Senna was placed at the center of the floor, on the same flagstone she had stood on 61 days before. Alistair did not take his seat at the hall's head. He stood at the edge of the dais with his arms loose at his sides and his war cloak still on him, and he waited until the hall had quieted to the specific quality of silence that a very large room achieves when every person in it understands that what they are about to hear will change what they know about themselves and their place in their own history. He spoke without raising his voice. He said that on the night of ashen frost in the year 847, 4 witnesses to the death of emissary Dane Fallow had been present in the South Wing corridor and had been paid to absent themselves from the tribunal. He named the sum paid and named the man who had paid it. He said that those 4 witnesses had been compelled under King's summons to appear before the allied councils of 2 neighboring kingdoms and had given their testimony under formal oath. The witnesses were brought in. An older woman who ran a linen storage room adjacent to the south corridor, who had heard the argument before the death and had seen the door from which the departing figure had emerged. A young supply handler who had been carrying linens and had pressed himself into an alcove when he heard raised voices and had waited and had seen a face. A senior guardsman who had been bribed 3 days before the tribunal with enough coin to retire on, and who could not look at the floor of the hall without his hands shaking. A 4th woman, a kitchen worker, who had been told that her testimony would cost her her position and her family's pack standing, and who had kept silent for 61 days with the specific grief of a person who knows exactly what their silence costs someone else. The kitchen worker, whose name was Lise, told her account in a voice that shook on every 3rd word and did not waver on the important ones. She had been in the south corridor that night. She had seen the figure enter the emissary's room. She had seen the figure leave. It had not been Senna. The hall produced a sound that was not quite any single thing. a long exhalation like a structure deciding whether to settle or crack. Mira did not look up. Voss took one step toward the foreign delegates with his mouth already forming an argument, and Alistair looked at him with those pale, nearly colorless eyes, and Voss went still in the way that a man goes still when the argument he has prepared has just registered that the room it was prepared for no longer exists. The case against him was not long in its presentation. The letter was read aloud, the full text of it, with Senna's cipher identified on the record, and its origin explained in 3 sentences. The instruction to the man in the Eastern Ward. The wordless message to the specific cell. The correspondence trail between Voss and the bribed guardsman, recovered from the guardsman's own house by the Allied Kingdom investigators under King's authority, stored in a locked brass box under the guardsman's floor stones, because people who take bribes for grave matters tend to keep receipts out of the same instinct that makes them take the bribe to begin with. Voss made his argument. It lasted 4 sentences before Alistair said 2 words that ended it, and the nature of the 2 words was such that the hall's senior pack elder, a man of 70 who had stood in the hall for every major tribunal of the past 4 decades, nodded once at the king with the gravity of a man confirming that the correct thing has been correctly named. What the law of Thornwood required for the crime of corrupted testimony in a capital trial, compounded by conspiracy to suppress evidence and the planned death of the condemned, was not a long deliberation. Voss was taken from the hall by 4 guards who had been positioned near him since his summons arrived. He did not reach the cells. He did not reach the outer keep. The judgment of a Lycan king on the road between the council chamber and the cells was a matter of his authority to exercise, and Alistair exercised it with the same quality of decision that characterized every other choice he had made in the past 61 days, which was to say that it was total and without performance and over very quickly. The hall, which had heard the sound from beyond the passage, was very still. Mira had begun to cry before Voss left the room. The crying was the kind that is not about grief for another person, but about the arrival of a specific and irrevocable clarity, the moment when a story a person has been telling themselves for 2 months stops being available as a story and becomes instead a record. She did not try to speak for some time. When she did, the account she gave was not complete, and it was not delivered with courage. But the essential facts were there, stripped of ornamentation by the sheer inability to construct a flattering frame for any of them. She had taken the silver-handled seal from Senna's healer satchel while Senna slept. She had met with Voss over 3 separate evenings in the fortnight before the emissary's death, drawn there by his suggestion that the treaty papers the emissary carried would reduce the available servant positions in the keep, a reduction that would affect Mira's own employment. A fact Voss had elaborated into a threat, and then elaborated further into a solution. She had not meant for it to be Senna who carried the blame. The hall did not receive this final clarification with the generosity she might have hoped for. Senna stood on the flagstone at the center of the floor and listened to her sister's voice, and felt the words arrive in her, the way cold water arrives when you have been expecting warmth. A full-body understanding that the thing you have been suspecting for 2 months is not a suspicion anymore. The grief of it was real, and it was its own thing, entirely distinct from what was happening in the hall around it, and she let it be real without performing what it required of her face, because she had learned that the most important moments of her life had not rewarded performance. The pack elder who had applied the banishment mark on the night of Ashen Frost came down from the tiers without being asked. He was old enough to move slowly, and the hall watched him cross to where Senna stood, and no one spoke. He took her left wrist in both hands, the same hands that had held it 61 days ago, and he placed his right palm over the mark and spoke the words of dissolution in the old healer pack tongue, 3 syllables her mother had known, and the mark came away from her skin the way a shadow comes away from a stone when the cloud moves off. Not dramatically, not with light or sound or physical magic she could describe to anyone later, but completely, and what remained was clean skin, pale where the burn had been, unmarked. She looked at it for a moment. Alistair had descended from the dais. She had not heard him move, which she would think about afterward, that a man of that size in that room had crossed to where she stood, and she had not heard a single footfall, only become aware of him, the way you become aware of a change in air pressure, suddenly and before you can name the cause. He was standing in front of her on the flagstone floor, and the hall around them had the quality of something that has been holding a single collective breath for 61 days and has just been given permission. He said her name. He said it the way he said the two words that had ended Voss's argument, which was to say, without ornamentation, as a statement of exactly and only what it was. Then he went to one knee on the stone. Not the formal pack kneel of ceremony, not the political genuflection of a sovereign managing an appearance. He went down on one knee on the flagstone floor of the tribunal hall, with the same quality of decision that had characterized everything else he had done since a ditch on the Eastern Road, full and without performance, and accompanied by the specific stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been traveling toward, for longer than he has been willing to admit. The hall descended with him, bench by bench and tier by tier, the sound of it a long, low settling like a great building finally completing the alignment it was built toward. The foreign delegates went to their knees last, the two delegations in their travel-worn colors, the mud of 3 kingdoms still on their boots, kneeling on the stone floor of Thornwood's tribunal hall, with the unhurried gravity of men who understood what they were witnessing and what it would mean in the records of 2 other kingdoms that had been compelled to carry its evidence. Mira, on the floor in her restraints, did not look up. Her fate was written without needing to be performed. She would be stripped of her pack standing and expelled from Thornwood's territory by morning, the mark on her wrist the inverse of the one that had been removed from Senna's, and she would carry it east into a waste that Senna knew the topography of with more precision than anyone who had just sentenced her. Senna would not speak against her, and she would not speak for her. She had already decided this. Her mother's hands in the mortar, patient and efficient, going on after the failure because the next attempt might be the one that mattered. It was not forgiveness. It was the decision to let the record stand on its own authority without her assistance. Alistair rose from the stone and looked at her and said, "The hall requires you to take a position." He meant the dais. He meant the chair at its head. He meant the title that accompanied it in the law of Thornwood, the one that belonged to the person who stood at the king's left on the dais floor, a position that had been vacant since the year 841 and that every council member in the tiers had been watching peripherally for 6 years. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I have a condition." He said, "Name it." She looked at the side door of the hall. She said, "The hound comes in." Something moved behind those pale eyes, brief and unguarded, and it was not amusement exactly, though it lived in the same country. He turned to the nearest guard and gave the instruction in 2 words, and the guard pulled the side door open. Bramble came through it with the purposeful amble of a creature who has been waiting outside doors his entire life and has developed opinions about the practice. He crossed the flagstone floor without acknowledging the kneeling assembly or the foreign delegates, or the council members in their tiered benches, his gray muzzle working at the air, his single eye bright. And he went directly to the base of the dais stairs and sat down and looked up at Senna with the patient and total attention that he had given her across the floor of the tribunal hall on the night of ashen frost, when every other set of eyes in the room had found somewhere else to be. She walked to the dais. The stairs were 6 steps, cut from the same pale stone as the floor, worn smooth along their centers by 60 years of official feet. She climbed them and stood at the top and looked out over the hall, over the kneeling assembly and the braziers and the foreign delegations, over the tiers of carved stone rising in their horseshoe, over the place on the flagstone where she had stood in borrowed boots, with a burned wrist and no cloak, while the verdict was read. Alistair came up the stairs behind her and stood at her right. It was not the position a king stood in. It was the position the wolf stands in when he has made a decision that the territory understands as permanent. The council elder who had dissolved her mark came to the foot of the dais stairs with the ceremonial cord in his hands, the kind used at formal claims, and he looked up at them both and waited. The cord was old, braided copper and ash wood thread, the kind of object that had been in the tribunal hall's keeping for longer than anyone in the room had been alive, its use infrequent enough that it still carried the weight of occasions rather than the weight of routine. What passed between Senna and Alistair in those next few minutes was not spoken for the assembly's benefit. It was two people in a charged room making specific, irrevocable decisions about what they would yield and what they would carry forward. The kind of decisions that can only be made after 61 days of proximity, and one sealed letter surrendered in a moment of terrible vulnerability, and 3 kingdoms ridden at pace. She had given him the letter when she could have withheld it. He had ridden to 2 kingdoms to compel testimony that his own tribunal had suppressed, which was an act of self-correction that no pack lord in the hall's 60 years had managed, because self-correction on that scale requires the specific kind of authority that is not threatened by its own error. The cord was bound. The elder spoke the words. The hall that had been kneeling rose. Outside, she knew without being able to see it, the packed snow in the tribunal hall's courtyard held the ruts of 1,200 returning soldiers and a traveling litter and a single one-eyed hound who had sat in the road in front of a war horse until the war horse relented. The night of the pale moon had broken cold and clear, the stars very bright and very far away, and indifferent to the specific business of the hall below them, the way stars tend to be, and the pale light of them fell through the tribunal hall's high windows onto the flagstone floor with the same quality of light that had fallen there 61 days ago, when the hall had been full of another kind of decision. The pack history would record what happened in Thornwood's tribunal hall on the night of the pale moon in the year 847 in the formal archival language, appropriate to counsels and claims and the reversal of capital judgments. It would record the 4 witnesses, the 2 kingdoms, the dissolved mark, the cord, the foreign delegations present. It would not record the smaller things, because the pack histories never did. It would not record that Senna's first act after the cord was bound was to look down at Bramble, who had moved from the foot of the stairs to a position at the dais's edge during the proceedings with the quiet, territorial authority of a very old dog who has decided where he lives. It would not record that she had kept a small piece of the ash salt compound's original waxed parchment in the inner pocket of the healer's satchel since her mother's last winter, pressed flat, smelling faintly of mineral ash and dried herb, the way her mother's hands had smelled when they were working. The parchment was still there, in the satchel that Petra had placed in the guarded chamber, and that now sat on a chair inside the tribunal hall's anteroom, waiting to be collected and moved to wherever Senna would sleep that night. She knew where it was. She was not going anywhere it was not. Bramble laid his gray muzzle on his forepaws at the edge of the dais, and closed his one eye in the manner of a creature who has seen what he came to see and has no further anxieties about the evening. The braziers burned low in their iron cradles. The hall held the warmth they had made, reluctantly, the way old stone always holds warmth, as if it is not quite sure the warmth is meant to stay. It stayed.